When two fake cops showed up to arrest a quiet homeowner over HOA violations, they didn't know he was the chief of police, and the whole thing was caught on camera. The knock wasn't loud, just 3 steady taps, but something about it made Gregory Harlan pause mid-step. He had a pot of coffee brewing and a half-folded newspaper on the kitchen counter. Saturday mornings were his reset time, the one part of the week that felt truly quiet. But those knocks, they had weight to them. He walked to the door, glanced through the peephole, and froze. 2 men stood on his porch, wearing navy uniforms with silver badges that caught the light. The one on the left, taller, clean-cut, had a clipboard tucked under his arm. The other stood with his hand on his belt, thumb brushing over a holstered gun. "Mr. Harlan," the tall one called out. "We have a warrant for your arrest." Gregory didn't move right away. Years in law enforcement had taught him that real authority never needed to shout. But something about their tone was off. Flat, rehearsed, like 2 actors reading from a script. He cracked the door open halfway. "Can I see your IDs?" The taller man's expression didn't change. "We'll explain everything once you're in custody, sir." "It's about a city code violation." Gregory blinked. A city code violation? For what? He had paid every fine, responded to every notice. The only conflict in his life lately had been with the HOA, the same people who sent letters about his mailbox paint and his truck being too visible. Still calm, he asked again, "Which department are you with?" The second man spoke this time. His voice was rough, impatient. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "Step outside." Gregory tilted his head slightly. The patches on their sleeves said, Metro Enforcement Division, a name he'd never heard in all his 22 years on the force. The badge numbers didn't look right either, both ending in zeros, perfectly symmetrical. Amateur mistake. "Give me 1 second, he said evenly, then closed the door without waiting for their response. Inside, he took a slow breath. His heartbeat was steady. He reached for his phone, tapped a contact labeled Dispatch, Priority. "This is Chief Harlan. I have 2 males at my residence claiming to be law enforcement. Check for any warrants under my name immediately," he said quietly. The dispatcher's voice came back, confused. "Chief, there's nothing." "You want backup?" "Send units." No sirens, he hung up and walked back toward the door. The men were still there, glancing around like they were deciding whether to break in. Gregory opened the door again, wider this time. "Gentlemen," he said calmly. "I asked for identification." The taller man sighed, flashing a wallet badge so fast it could have been from a movie prop set. Gregory didn't even bother hiding his smirk. "You said you're with the Metro Enforcement Division?" "That's right." "Interesting," Gregory replied. "Because there's no such department in this county." The shorter one stepped forward. "Sir, are you resisting?" Gregory's eyes hardened. "No, I'm waiting." Just then, the faint rumble of engines echoed from down the street. 3 black SUVs rolled in, silent, no sirens, no lights, just authority arriving with quiet precision. The fake officers stiffened, realizing too late what was happening. One of the SUVs stopped right behind Gregory's driveway. Real officers stepped out, hands on holsters. Within seconds, both imposters were on their knees, their fake badges glinting uselessly on the pavement. From the porch, Gregory watched it all without raising his voice. "You came to arrest me," he said softly. "But you didn't even check who I was." The taller man tried to stammer an excuse. "We were told. By who?" Gregory cut him off. His tone stayed controlled, but his words carried steel. The man swallowed hard and looked away. When the last SUV door shut and the situation was under control, Gregory turned and looked down the street. Neighbors were peeking through blinds, watching. He could already imagine Sandra Whitmore, the HOA president, pretending she had nothing to do with this. But he knew better. The morning air felt heavier now, not because of fear, but clarity. Someone had gone too far, and whoever had pulled the strings behind this stunt had just made the biggest mistake of their life. But before Gregory made a single call, he wanted to understand why. Who would risk sending fake cops to his door? And what did they really think they'd find once he opened it? 2 weeks earlier, things in the neighborhood seemed perfectly ordinary. at least on the surface. Gregory Harlan's house sat at the end of Maplewood Drive, a clean cul-de-sac lined with trimmed hedges and flags fluttering on most porches. He'd bought the home 10 years earlier, back when his promotion to chief had finally given him enough time to slow down and enjoy a quieter life. His days started early. Coffee at 6, a morning jog through Greenfield Park, then a stop at the bakery on Old Mill Road for a warm cinnamon roll and a quick chat with the owner, Mr. Lang. People in town respected Gregory. They just didn't know him. And that was fine by him. Less attention meant fewer assumptions. But lately he'd noticed things changing. The glances, the half-smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. It began after a new HOA president took over. Sandra Whitmore, a woman who had moved in less than a year ago from Florida, and immediately began treating the neighborhood like her personal kingdom. At first, she seemed harmless enough. She introduced herself with a clipboard in hand and a forced laugh that sounded like she practiced it in the mirror. "We're just keeping the community up to standard, Mr. Harlan," she'd said the first time she walked up his driveway, pointing at a few leaves near the gutter. "You understand, right? We want to make sure everything looks presentable," Gregory had smiled politely. "I think we're all doing our part, ma'am." She didn't like the calmness in his tone. Some people mistake peace for arrogance, and Sandra was one of them. A few days later, Gregory received his first violation notice in the mail. Mailbox paint fading. Correction required within 7 days. He laughed quietly, repainted it that same afternoon, and thought that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The second notice came a week later. Unauthorized vehicle parked overnight. Black pickup truck visible from the street. That truck was his. It had been there since the day he moved in. He walked down to the HOA office, a small rented room beside the local library, and calmly asked for clarification. Sandra was there, typing furiously at her laptop. She didn't even look up. "Oh, Mr. Harlan," she said flatly. "We've had several complaints." Rules are rules. From who? She stopped typing. "That's confidential." He studied her face for a moment. The faint smirk, the tone that suggested she enjoyed the power just a little too much. "You know," Gregory said, "I've worked with a lot of rule books in my life. They usually make more sense when applied equally." Her expression tightened. "We treat everyone the same." "Do you?" he asked. There was a pause. Then, without a word, Sandra turned back to her computer. Gregory left without pushing further. He knew better than to argue with people who needed control to feel important. Still, the situation gnawed at him. Not because of the fines or the rules, but because it wasn't really about those things. He'd seen this kind of behavior before. Authority without accountability always led to the same place. Back home, his neighbor across the street, Harold Dean, waved him over. Harold was in his late 60s, a retired electrician with skin tanned deep from years of outdoor work. "Hey, Greg," he said quietly. "You got one of those letters too, huh?" Gregory nodded. "Seems like she's making rounds." Harold shook his head. "She's been complaining about your truck and your flag, man. Said it makes the neighborhood look political." "Can you believe that?" Gregory smiled faintly. "I believe people show their character when they think they have authority." Harold lowered his voice. "Careful with her, though. She's been running meetings like it's her courtroom. Folks are too scared to speak up." Gregory's smile faded. "Scared of what?" "Being next." That night, Gregory stood on his porch, watching the streetlights flicker. His American flag waved lightly in the breeze, the same one his father gave him after his first day on the police force. He wasn't moving it for anyone. Inside, he reviewed his security cameras, adjusting the angles to cover the walkway and the front gate. It wasn't paranoia, just habit. Years in law enforcement teach you that prevention is quieter than reaction. And yet something in the back of his mind whispered that this wasn't over. He could feel the tension building, like a storm forming just beyond the horizon, too far to see, but close enough to sense in the air. He didn't know it yet, but Sandra wasn't finished testing him. What started as small violations would soon twist into something darker, something personal. But before things spiraled, Gregory would learn just how far some people will go when their authority is questioned. And this time, Their target had far more power than they realized. A week later, another letter arrived, thicker than the others, with a red, urgent stamp across the top. Gregory set it on the kitchen counter and stared at it for a long moment before opening it. The letter was written in the same clipped tone as the last two, but this time the accusations had grown bolder. Failure to comply with multiple neighborhood standards. Immediate hearing required. Gregory exhaled slowly. They wanted a confrontation. He put the letter aside, poured himself a cup of coffee, and looked out the kitchen window. The neighborhood looked picture-perfect that morning. Lawns trimmed, cars washed, flags waving in the light wind. Yet beneath that calm exterior, he could feel something brewing. Whispers, quiet glances, the kind of silent tension that spreads when someone decides one man doesn't belong. That evening, he walked over to the community hall for the HOA meeting. The parking lot was half full. A few neighbors stood near the entrance, chatting in low voices that stopped when he approached. He gave a polite smile anyway. "Evening," he said. No one answered. Inside, the room smelled faintly of coffee and carpet cleaner. A folding table sat at the front with a row of plastic nameplates. Sandra Whitmore sat in the middle, wearing a coral blazer and that same fixed smile that never reached her eyes. On either side of her were two board members, Lydia Brent, a real estate agent who agreed with everything Sandra said, and Gordon Pike, a retired insurance adjuster who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. Gregory took a seat near the back. Sandra tapped her pen against the table. "We'll begin with property violations," she announced, her voice loud and clear. "Item 1. Repeated non-compliance at 1149 Maplewood Drive." Heads turned. That was his address. Sandra smiled sweetly. "Mr. Harlan, you've been sent 3 notices regarding your property. The mailbox, the truck, and the flag. Yet you continue to disregard our rules." Gregory leaned forward slightly. "I've complied with every notice you've sent," he said. "The mailbox was repainted, and my truck is parked on my property. As for the flag, it's within the size limits stated in the HOA handbook." Sandra's tone sharpened. "Yes, but several residents feel the overall appearance doesn't align with the neighborhood's image." He raised an eyebrow. "The neighborhood's image?" Lydia chimed in quickly. "It's about uniformity, Mr. Harlan. We just want everything to look cohesive. So, like everyone else?" Gordon cleared his throat quietly. "Maybe we could move to the next issue." Sandra cut him off. "Not yet. Mr. Harlan, the HOA is considering a fine for continued resistance to compliance." A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Gregory's neighbor Harold sat near the back, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Gregory stood slowly. His height and calm presence commanded attention without effort. "Let me make sure I understand," he said evenly. "You're fining me for following your rules because you don't like how it looks." Sandra's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "We have the right to enforce community standards." "And I have the right to due process," Gregory replied. "If you're issuing fines, I'll need documentation. Actual photos, written complaints, dates, and the names of the board members who voted on it." The room went quiet. Sandra looked caught off guard. "That's not typically shared with homeowners," she said. "Then this meeting is over," Gregory said simply, collecting his folder. "You can't enforce rules you can't prove." He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, Sandra muttered, just loud enough for him to hear, "Some people think the rules don't apply to them." He stopped, turned back, and looked directly at her. "No," he said quietly. "Some people just don't like being challenged by someone they can't control." For a moment, no one spoke. The sound of the air conditioner filled the silence. Then Gregory left. Outside, Harold caught up with him. "That was something," he said. "They'll push harder now." Gregory replied, "People like Sandra don't stop when they're embarrassed." They doubled down. "Maybe you should tell them what you do for a living," Harold suggested. Gregory shook his head. "No, let them show who they really are." That night, he sat on his porch again, lights off, watching the quiet rhythm of the street. A dog barked in the distance. Somewhere down the block, a sprinkler clicked on. It was all so peaceful, but he knew peace like that could be deceiving. It wasn't real. Not anymore. He pulled out his phone and saved the HOA meeting video from the security camera in his shirt pocket. Just in case. He didn't plan to use it, unless he had to. But that meeting had lit a fuse, and Sandra's pride wouldn't let it burn out quietly. The next move she made would cross a line that could never be undone. The next HOA meeting wasn't scheduled for another month, but Sandra Whitmore called an emergency session. The email went out on a Tuesday night, formal, stiff, and full of urgency. Mandatory attendance requested. Discussion. Community compliance concerns. Gregory knew exactly what it meant. They wanted a show. By the time he arrived, the small hall on Meadowbrook Avenue was already buzzing with low conversations. Folding chairs formed uneven rows, and the smell of burnt coffee filled the air. Sandra stood near the front, pacing with a clipboard, her pearl necklace gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He walked in, greeted Harold with a nod, and took a seat near the side wall. The board members, Sandra, Lydia Brent, and Gordon Pike, were already whispering to one another. When the clock struck 7, Sandra clapped her hands together. "Let's bring this meeting to order," she said, her tone cheery and commanding. "We have an important issue tonight, one that affects the entire neighborhood." She didn't even try to hide who the issue was. Several residents have expressed concern about a growing lack of compliance. Sandra continued, pacing dramatically. "And it seems certain homeowners believe they're exempt from the same rules the rest of us follow." Gregory stayed silent, his face unreadable. He had seen interrogation rooms with less tension. Sandra gestured toward a slide on the small projector screen. It showed a photo of his house, zoomed in on his flagpole, truck, and front lawn. "Now, while we all appreciate patriotism, we also must maintain visual harmony," she said. Lydia added, "We've also had reports of an unauthorized visitor vehicle parked overnight." Gregory leaned forward. "That's my nephew's car. He's a paramedic, works 12-hour shifts and stops here sometimes to rest." Sandra turned to him, smiling tightly. "Yes, but the rule states—" "I know what the rule states," Gregory interrupted. "It also allows for exceptions in the case of emergency or family visitors." Her smile faltered. "Well, perhaps next time you could notify us in advance." He held her gaze. "Do other residents have to do that?" Sandra hesitated. The question hung heavy in the air. "We handle complaints on a case-by-case basis," she said finally. "Then why am I the only one who keeps getting them?" A murmur spread through the crowd. Someone whispered near the back. "He's got a point." Sandra's jaw tightened. "Mr. Harlan, no one is targeting you. These are standard procedures." Gregory took a slow breath. "You've sent me 3 letters, fined me for things I already corrected, and called this emergency meeting. About me. So forgive me if that doesn't feel standard." Silence. Even Lydia looked uncomfortable now. Then Harold stood up. "Sandra, I've lived here 15 years. I've seen worse yards than Greg's go untouched. You're singling him out and everybody knows it." Sandra's face reddened. "Mr. Dean, please refrain from accusations." "It's not an accusation," Harold said. "It's the truth." Several neighbors shifted in their seats, murmuring in agreement. For the first time, Sandra looked rattled. She tried to recover. "We just want consistency." "We can't have people bending the rules whenever it suits them." Gregory's tone stayed calm but firm. "Consistency starts with fairness. You enforce the rules selectively. That's not order. That's control." Her voice cracked slightly. "You think you're above the HOA, Mr. Harlan?" He didn't raise his voice, but the quiet authority in it made the room still. "No, ma'am. I just don't think the HOA is above the law." The words landed like a slap. Sandra's expression froze, and for a moment she didn't know what to say. Gordon Pike cleared his throat again, this time louder. "Maybe we should take a vote," he said softly. Sandra nodded stiffly, still avoiding Gregory's eyes. "Fine. All in favor of issuing a formal citation for non-compliance?" No hands went up. Not one. Gregory gathered his folder, nodded to Harold, and started toward the door. He could feel eyes following him, some with quiet support, others with resentment. He wasn't looking for allies. He just wanted peace. As he reached the door, Sandra's voice stopped him. "Mr. Harlan, you may think you've won tonight, she said coldly. "But this community won't tolerate arrogance forever." He turned slightly, met her eyes, and said calmly, "Neither will justice." Then he walked out. Outside, the air felt heavy and cool. Streetlights flickered over the parked cars. Harold caught up to him again, muttering, "You hit a nerve in there." "Yeah," Gregory replied. "And people like Sandra don't forget when you do." He looked back toward the building's glass doors, where Sandra stood glaring through the reflection. Her expression wasn't just angry, it was calculating. That was when Gregory realized this wasn't about the HOA anymore. It was personal now, and people who take things personally often do reckless things. But Gregory didn't know just how reckless Sandra was willing to get, or how far she'd go to prove a point she should have never tried to make. The day after that meeting, Sandra Whitmore's composure cracked. In her mind, Gregory Harlan had humiliated her, in front of her board, her neighbors, and worst of all, the people she wanted to impress. Control was everything to her, and Gregory had taken it away with one calm sentence. By noon the next day, she was sitting in her kitchen surrounded by HOA papers, her laptop open, and a half-finished glass of white wine sweating beside it. She kept replaying his words in her head. The HOA isn't above the law. The way he'd said it, confident and unbothered, had lit a fire she couldn't put out. Her friend and fellow board member, Lydia Brent, stopped by unannounced. She leaned against the counter, sipping her coffee nervously. "Sandra, maybe it's time to let this go. He's right, technically. We don't have any standing to fine him again." Sandra glared at her. "You think I don't know that?" "The man's mocking us." "Mocking me?" Lydia shifted her weight. "He's not mocking you. He just Don't defend him," Sandra snapped. "Do you realize what happens if we let this slide? Everyone else will start doing whatever they want. We'll have junk cars, broken fences, God knows what else." "But this isn't about the neighborhood anymore, is it?" Lydia asked quietly. Sandra slammed her glass down hard enough to spill the wine. "He thinks he can embarrass me. I'll show him what happens when you disrespect authority." Those words hung in the air longer than they should have. Lydia left not long after, shaking her head. That evening, Sandra made 2 phone calls. One to Rick Danvers, a former security contractor who had done small, private enforcement jobs for the HOA before, mostly harmless tasks like towing cars and warning fence violators. The other call was to Eddie Colburn, Rick's partner, a man with a criminal record that Sandra conveniently ignored. The meeting took place at a small diner off Highway 278 just outside town. The place smelled like grease and old coffee, with neon lights flickering against the windows. Sandra sat in the booth with her neatly folded HOA binder beside her. Rick arrived first, mid-40s, muscular, tattooed arms barely covered by a short-sleeved shirt. Eddie came a few minutes later, chewing gum and looking bored. "You said this was about a job?" Rick asked. Sandra nodded. "A resident has repeatedly violated community standards. We've exhausted normal channels. I want to make sure he understands that our rules aren't optional." Rick raised an eyebrow. "You want us to rough him up?" "Of course not," she said quickly, glancing around the diner. "Just a visit. Something official-looking. Maybe make him think it's law enforcement." Eddie grinned. "So, scare him a little?" Sandra hesitated, just long enough to confirm what she was really asking. "Exactly. He's been uncooperative. Maybe it's time he saw what non-compliance leads to." Rick leaned back. "We can do that. I've got old uniforms, badges, even a couple of fake citation forms. Looks official enough if you don't stare too close." Sandra lowered her voice. "Good. Do it next Saturday morning. He lives at the end of Maplewood Drive. I'll make sure he's home." Rick smirked. "What's the guy's name?" "Gregory Harlan." Eddie frowned. "Harlan? That name sounds familiar." Rick shrugged. "Probably just some retired cop. Don't worry about it." Sandra's tone hardened. "He's not a cop. He's a bully. A man who thinks the rules don't apply to him. They agreed on a price. A few $100s in cash." Sandra paid up front. As they left, she watched through the diner window as the 2 men laughed, shaking hands before heading to their truck. She felt a twisted sense of satisfaction rise in her chest. Finally, she thought, she was taking back control. That night, she sat on her porch with a glass of wine, staring down the street toward Gregory's house. The lights inside were on, his truck parked in the driveway, the flag swaying gently above it. "Enjoy your peace while it lasts," she whispered. Across the street, Harold watched her from his living room window. He'd seen her talking to strangers earlier that evening, and something didn't sit right. He couldn't hear what was said, but he recognized the look on her face. The same look she'd had after that meeting. Pride, anger, and something darker. He made a mental note to tell Gregory the next time he saw him. But Gregory had been called into work early that week. A case in a neighboring county had kept him late most nights, reviewing files and coordinating task forces. He was tired, focused, unaware that the people living just across the street were setting him up. The plan was already in motion, but what Sandra didn't realize was that the man she was targeting wasn't the type to break under pressure, and the uniform she was trying to use against him was one he wore better than anyone she'd ever meet. Saturday morning arrived soft and pale, with a thin layer of fog hugging the lawns on Maplewood Drive. Gregory was finally off duty for the weekend, his first full day at home in almost a week. He brewed his coffee, flipped on a jazz station, and sat at the kitchen table to read the paper. It was peaceful, calm, the kind of morning you wish could last forever. Then came the knock. 3 steady, deliberate taps. He didn't move at first. The rhythm was too precise, too calculated to be casual. He set his cup down, listened for a second knock, and there it was. 3 more. Sharper this time. Gregory walked to the door, checked the peephole, and frowned. 2 men stood outside in full uniform, or at least what looked like it. Their badges caught the light just enough to seem real, but something about the way they carried themselves was wrong. Real officers have posture. These men had performance. The taller one, Rick Danvers, stood with a clipboard in hand, pretending to read from it. The shorter one, Eddie Colburn, had his hand resting too casually on his holster. Gregory opened the door halfway, keeping the chain latch in place. "Can I help you?" "Mr. Harlan," Rick said. "We have a warrant for your arrest. You've been charged with repeated violations of local property codes." Gregory raised an eyebrow. "City code violations?" "That's correct," Rick said confidently, though his eyes darted for a split second. The kind of flicker Gregory had seen in hundreds of interrogations. "Which department are you from?" Eddie answered this time, impatient. "Metro Enforcement Division, sir. You need to come with us." Gregory gave a small, measured smile. "Never heard of it." Eddie's jaw tightened. "You will once you're booked." Gregory tilted his head slightly. "You know, that's funny. I've worked with every department in this state, and I've never once seen a badge like that." Rick shifted. "Sir, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to escalate." "Escalate?" Gregory repeated calmly. "Over a mailbox?" Neither man responded. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Gregory's gaze dropped briefly to their boots. Scuffed and mismatched. Rookie mistake. Then to the patrol car parked crookedly near his driveway. The license plate was covered with tape. He exhaled slowly through his nose. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady, "I'll need to verify your credentials before I go anywhere." Eddie smirked. "You think we're bluffing?" Gregory didn't answer. He closed the door halfway, pretending to grab something from a side table. In reality, his hand reached for the phone in his pocket. 1 tap. That was all it took to alert dispatch. Back outside, Rick called out, "You're making a mistake, Mr. Harlan." Gregory's voice came from behind the door. "So are you." A few moments later, the distant hum of engines broke the stillness. 3 black SUVs turned onto Maplewood Drive, moving in quiet synchronization. The fake officers glanced at each other, confused. Rick muttered, "What the hell?" Before they could react, the SUVs stopped at the curb. Real officers stepped out, armed, alert, and focused. Within seconds, commands filled the air. "Hands where we can see them! Drop the clipboard!" Eddie raised his hands instantly, panic washing across his face. Rick tried to speak, but his words tumbled out in useless fragments. Gregory opened his front door slowly and stepped out. He didn't have to say a word. Every officer on that street knew who he was. Chief Gregory Harlan, head of Douglas County Police Department, standing calm in jeans and a t-shirt, watching as his men surrounded the imposters. The officers moved efficiently, handcuffing Rick and Eddie while verifying their fake credentials. One of them turned to Gregory. "Chief, you want us to handle this, or you want to make the call yourself?" Gregory folded his arms. "Handle it by the book." As the two men were escorted to the curb, Sandra Whitmore's silver SUV came creeping down the street. She slowed when she saw the flashing lights. Her eyes widened as she spotted Gregory standing beside uniformed officers. He looked directly at her, didn't wave, didn't speak, just held her gaze long enough for her to understand that whatever game she started was over. One of the officers approached Sandra's window. "Ma'am, can you step out of the vehicle?" She stammered. What's this about?" Gregory's voice cut through the air, calm but commanding. "They said they had a warrant for my arrest. The paperwork came from someone in the HOA. Would you happen to know who authorized that?" Sandra froze. The color drained from her face. I don't know what you're talking about." Gregory's expression didn't change. "Then I'm sure the investigation will clear that up." Gregory's expression didn't change. "Then I'm sure the investigation will clear that up." The officers finished reading the imposters their rights. Eddie was nearly in tears, trying to explain that it was just supposed to be a warning. Rick kept quiet, jaw clenched, as if realizing the gravity of what they'd done. Neighbors had started gathering along the sidewalks, whispering, recording on their phones. The whole street buzzed with disbelief. Gregory turned to one of his officers. "Get a copy of that doorbell footage." "Yes, sir." Sandra stood frozen beside her car, trembling slightly. She had wanted to teach him a lesson. Instead, she had taught the entire neighborhood one. Gregory gave her one final look before walking back to his porch. "You should have just left me alone," he said quietly. Then he closed the door. Inside, the clock ticked softly. The smell of coffee still lingered from earlier that morning, now cold in the cup he'd abandoned. But while the imposters were being driven away in handcuffs, Gregory knew this wasn't over. The legal part was easy. It was the fallout that would test every boundary of decency in that neighborhood. And the people who once whispered about him were about to start whispering about her. The next morning, Maplewood Drive looked like a movie set after the cameras stopped rolling. The street was quiet again, but the energy had shifted. People who once waved at Sandra Whitmore now crossed to the other side when she walked her dog. Conversations that used to stop when Gregory passed by had turned into awkward silence. The truth was out, or at least part of it. Gregory hadn't said a word publicly. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. The entire incident, the fake cops, the confrontation, the look on Sandra's face, had been caught in full detail on his doorbell camera. The footage had already been submitted to investigators and shared with the district attorney's office. By mid-morning, word spread fast. Channel 5 Atlanta picked up the story, describing it as an attempted impersonation of law enforcement targeting a local police chief. The HOA's name wasn't mentioned at first, but within hours the connection surfaced. Neighbors leaked emails, screenshots, and even text messages from Sandra to the board about teaching Harlan a lesson. Harold Dean was sitting on his porch when reporters started driving by. "You really stirred up a hornet's nest, didn't you?" he said when Gregory walked over. Gregory managed a tired smile. "Didn't mean to. I just wanted to drink my coffee in peace." Harold chuckled, shaking his head. "You know, half the folks around here are pretending they didn't support her. But I remember the looks they gave you." "I do too," Gregory said quietly. People don't like being reminded of what they ignored. Later that afternoon, he got a call from Detective Rhonda Stillwell, the lead investigator assigned to the case. Her tone was professional but sympathetic. "Chief, we've confirmed the two men confessed. Said they were paid cash by a woman named Sandra Whitmore. Claimed she told them you were some problem neighbor. They didn't even know who you were until we booked them." Gregory was silent for a moment. Did they say why she wanted it to look like an arrest? Her words were, quote, to scare him straight. He sighed. You got enough to charge her? Oh, plenty. Stillwell said. False impersonation of an officer, conspiracy, harassment. The list's long, but I thought you should know before it hits the press. Thanks, Rhonda, he said. Just make sure it's clean. I don't want this turning into a circus. Too late for that, Chief. It's already trending. By evening, every local outlet had the story. Comment sections exploded with opinions, some shocked, some defensive, others cruel. But one headline stood out more than the rest. HOA president under investigation after orchestrating fake arrest attempt on black police chief. Sandra's name was now everywhere. The next day she tried to issue a statement, a stumbling apology that she emailed to every resident in the neighborhood. I deeply regret the misunderstanding. It began. My actions were intended to protect our community standards, not to harm anyone. The email backfired instantly. Screenshots of it flooded social media, with residents forwarding it to reporters. By noon, her resignation was demanded by nearly everyone on the board. At the same time, Gregory received dozens of messages from people he barely knew, neighbors who had avoided him for years suddenly reaching out to check in or say they always respected him. He didn't reply to most. He wasn't bitter. He just understood what guilt sounded like when it wore a friendly tone. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the rooftops, Harold walked over with a six-pack of beer. You know, he said, settling into one of Gregory's porch chairs, I've lived here a long time. Never seen someone handle something like that with so much composure. Gregory smiled faintly. I learned early on that anger makes noise. Dignity leaves evidence. Harold took a sip and nodded. You think she'll go to jail? Probably not, Gregory said. But her name's ruined. People like her fear that more than anything. They sat in silence for a while, watching kids ride bikes down the street. For the first time in weeks, it almost felt peaceful again. But later that night, Gregory received another message, this time from an unknown number. It was a photo of his own front yard, taken from across the street. The text underneath read, You may have won, but you don't belong here. He stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he saved the number and forwarded it straight to Detective Stillwell. He wasn't angry. He was just done. But as the investigation deepened and the media swarmed the story, the truth would expose more than one person's prejudice. It would reveal how fragile the illusion of civility can be when people think power makes them untouchable. By the following week, Maplewood Drive was unrecognizable, not in appearance, but in atmosphere. The manicured lawns and trimmed hedges still looked perfect, but underneath the neat symmetry lay a deep discomfort that no one could disguise anymore. Sandra Whitmore had officially resigned from her HOA position. The board's website carried a short, sterile notice. Due to recent events, Ms. Whitmore will no longer be serving as HOA president. No explanation, no apology, just an empty statement pretending everything was normal. But nothing was normal. Not anymore. Residents who once lined up to follow Sandra's rules now avoided her house completely. Her bright flowerbeds and expensive patio furniture suddenly looked out of place, like props from a play that had closed weeks ago. She spent her days drawing curtains, avoiding reporters, and whispering to lawyers over the phone. The same confidence she flaunted at every meeting had vanished. Across the street, Gregory kept his routine the same. He mowed his lawn, waved to the mail carrier, and still parked his truck in the same spot. He didn't gloat. He didn't even mention what had happened. Not to anyone, not even Harold. But the neighborhood couldn't stop talking. On Wednesday, a town meeting was held at Douglas County Hall to address community concerns. Gregory hadn't planned to go, but Detective Rhonda Stillwell called him earlier that day. You might want to be there, she said. People are asking questions. Some of them about you. When he arrived, the hall was already full. Cameras, reporters, city officials. Everyone wanted a piece of the story. Sandra sat 3 rows ahead, her lawyer beside her. Her hands trembled slightly, but her chin was lifted, trying to salvage whatever pride she had left. The moderator cleared his throat. We're here to discuss the recent impersonation incident and the ongoing investigation involving the Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association. Gregory listened as Rhonda presented her findings. Every detail documented, every statement verified. The imposters had confessed, the payments traced, and Sandra's text to Rick and Eddie read aloud for the record. Gasps echoed through the room as her own words filled the air. "Make sure he sees the badge." "I want him to feel it." Sandra shrank in her seat. When it was Gregory's turn to speak, he stood slowly, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the microphone. The flash of cameras made the room hum with anticipation. "I've served in law enforcement for 22 years, he began. "I've seen people do a lot of wrong things for a lot of bad reasons. But what happened here wasn't just about me. It was about the idea that some people think they can decide who belongs and who doesn't." The room stayed silent. "I moved into that neighborhood because I believed in community," he continued. "Because I thought being part of something meant respect, not control. What happened wasn't just harassment. It was fear. Fear dressed up as authority." He paused, looking directly at Sandra. "But authority without accountability isn't strength. It's weakness hiding behind paperwork." A few people clapped quietly. Others just sat still, letting the weight of his words settle. After the meeting, reporters swarmed outside, shouting questions. "Chief Harlan, are you pressing charges personally? Do you plan to move? How do you feel about your neighbors now?" He gave one short answer. "I'm not moving. This is my home." That quote made the evening news. Within hours it became a headline. "Police chief refuses to leave after HOA scandal. This is my home." It resonated far beyond Douglas County. News outlets across the country picked it up. Some saw it as a story about racism and arrogance. Others framed it as a debate about homeowners' rights. Gregory didn't care how they spun it. All he cared about was that the truth was finally visible, the quiet kind of truth that can't be ignored once it's seen. Days later, Harold came by again. "You know," he said, leaning on the porch railing, "people around here walk different now. It's like they're afraid to show who they really are." Gregory nodded. "Maybe that's a good start. You think she'll ever face real punishment?" "She's already facing it," Gregory said. "She's living with what she did." That's a sentence all its own. That night, Gregory sat alone in his living room. The news on TV replayed clips of his speech, but he muted it. Through the window he could see his flag swaying under the porch light, the same one Sandra tried to shame him for. It no longer represented just patriotism to him. It represented defiance in the quietest, most dignified form. He wasn't proud of what happened, but he was proud of how he handled it. And maybe, he thought, that was the real victory. Not proving anyone wrong, but refusing to become what they wanted him to be. But while the story seemed to settle publicly, beneath the surface, more secrets were about to surface. And not everyone who played a part in Sandra's plan was ready to face the consequences that were still coming. By the second week, the story had grown beyond anyone's control. It was no longer just a local scandal. It was national news. Major outlets like The Washington Post and USA Today picked up the story, running headlines about abuse of HOA power and police chief outsmarts. Fake cops sent by HOA president. News vans began parking at the edge of Maplewood Drive, and reporters stood in front of Sandra Whitmore's house every morning, hoping for a soundbite. Gregory didn't like the attention. He never did. He wasn't chasing fame. He was trying to move past the noise. But the world had a way of turning real pain into public spectacle, and now strangers had opinions about his life. The department's PR team had advised him to make a short public statement. So, one Friday morning, he stood at the podium of the Douglas County Police Department, cameras pointed straight at him, microphones cluttered in front of his face. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady. "I appreciate the support, but I want to make something clear. This isn't about me versus one person. It's about what happens when people let authority turn into entitlement." He paused, letting the words breathe. "My message is simple. If you lead people, in any capacity, you owe them fairness, not fear. And if you make a mistake, own it. Don't hide behind excuses." It wasn't long, but it was powerful. That clip spread faster than any headline could. His composure, his tone, calm, measured, not vengeful, struck a chord with people who had experienced the same kind of quiet discrimination. After the press conference, Gregory stepped outside to find a group of residents waiting. Some were from his neighborhood. Others had driven from nearby towns just to shake his hand. An older woman approached first, her voice trembling. "Chief Harlan, I just wanted to say thank you. What you did. It gave a lot of us courage." He smiled gently. "You don't need courage to be decent," he said. "You just need to remember what's right." Meanwhile, the investigation into Sandra's conduct had taken a new turn. Detective Stillwell discovered that the HOA funds had been mishandled. Records showed several unauthorized transactions, landscaping expenses that didn't exist, contractor fees with no invoices, and even payments made to a consultant that turned out to be one of Rick Danvers's shell accounts. When confronted, Sandra broke down during questioning. The woman who once ruled HOA meetings with icy confidence now sat in a small interrogation room, shoulders slumped. "I just wanted order," she whispered, voice cracking. "You don't understand what it's like trying to keep people in line." Stillwell looked at her, unimpressed. "Keeping people in line isn't your job. Treating them fairly is. You crossed that line, and you dragged others with you." Sandra buried her face in her hands. "I didn't think it would go this far, but it had. And now there was no walking it back." Later that week, Gregory received a call from the district attorney's office confirming the charges. Sandra would face counts of conspiracy, harassment, and impersonation through proxy. Rick and Eddie were charged separately and agreed to testify in exchange for lighter sentences. When the news broke, the community reaction split cleanly down the middle. Some believed she deserved prison time. Others said she had simply made a bad decision. But one thing was certain. Her reputation was gone. The same neighbors who once applauded her strictness now treated her like a stain they couldn't scrub away fast enough. On Sunday morning, Gregory saw her for the first time since the incident. She was walking to her mailbox, dressed in sweatpants, her hair unkempt, head down. The woman who once smiled for control now barely looked up. Their eyes met briefly. She froze, unsure whether to speak. Gregory gave her a small nod, not out of forgiveness, but acknowledgement. The kind of nod that says, "You did this. Live with it." She looked like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Instead, she turned and went back inside. The door shut softly behind her. Harold came over later that day, carrying his usual six-pack. "You think that's the last we'll hear of her?" he asked, settling into the chair beside Gregory. "Probably not," Gregory replied. "But that's okay. I'm not fighting her anymore. I've got nothing left to prove." Harold chuckled. "Man, you handled this whole thing better than anyone I've ever seen. I would have lost it." Gregory looked out toward the street, where kids were playing basketball near the cul-de-sac. "If I'd lost it, I would have given her exactly what she wanted." Sometimes the best revenge is staying calm long enough for people to see who's really out of control. They sat in quiet for a while. The world outside was still watching, but here on Maplewood Drive, life was finally beginning to breathe again. That night, as Gregory turned off the porch light, he thought about everything that had happened. How one person's hatred had exposed an entire community's silence, and how the truth had forced everyone to look at themselves differently. But for Gregory, the real reckoning wasn't about punishment. It was about perspective. Because when a man's dignity is tested, how he responds becomes his legacy, and Gregory Harlan had written his in patience, not anger. A month passed before the media finally moved on. The vans disappeared, the cameras stopped showing up, and the story about the HOA scandal was replaced by newer headlines. But inside the community, things had permanently shifted. People were polite, but distant. Conversations were shorter. Even the neighborhood's summer cookout, usually a big event, was cancelled due to lack of interest. Gregory didn't mind the quiet. He'd gotten what he always wanted, peace. But it came at a cost. He couldn't walk down Maplewood Drive without noticing how people avoided eye contact, how they tried too hard to act normal. Some carried guilt, others carried resentment. And a few, he suspected, were still waiting for him to leave. He didn't. Every morning, He still jogged past Greenfield Park, waved to the bakery owner on Old Mill Road, and came home to his same house, mailbox freshly painted, flag fluttering above the porch. That flag meant something different now. It wasn't a decoration. It was a statement. One Saturday, as he was trimming his hedges, a teenage boy from down the street stopped by. His name was Caleb Monroe, Sandra's neighbor. He looked nervous, holding his bike by the handlebars. Mr. Harlan?" he said. Gregory wiped his hands with a rag. "Yeah, son. What's up?" "My dad said I shouldn't talk to you," Caleb said quickly. "But I wanted to. I wanted to say, I'm sorry for what happened. My mum said people treated you wrong." Gregory studied him for a moment, then smiled softly. "You didn't do anything wrong, Caleb." The boy nodded, eyes fixed on the ground. "Yeah, but people did. And nobody said anything." Gregory put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's how most wrong things stay alive. Because good people stay quiet. The important part is that you noticed." Don't forget that Caleb smiled shyly and rode off. Gregory stood there watching him go, realizing that maybe the story wasn't just about justice or humiliation. It was about the next generation watching how adults handled power and learning what not to repeat. A few days later, Harold invited him to a small barbecue at his place. Just a handful of neighbors came, the ones who'd always been decent regardless of the noise. They sat around laughing softly, trading old stories about work and life. "You ever think about leaving?" Harold asked at one point, his voice low. Gregory poked at the coals with a stick. "I thought about it," he said. "But if I left, she'd win. The whole idea that people like me don't belong here. That's exactly what they wanted. I'm not giving them that satisfaction." Harold nodded. "Guess standing your ground looks different when you do it with grace." Gregory chuckled. "Grace doesn't mean staying quiet. It means staying decent while you make your point." As the evening sun faded, the neighborhood seemed almost normal again. Kids rode bikes, porch lights flicked on one by one, and for the first time in weeks, laughter carried faintly down the block. Later that night, Gregory sat on his porch alone. He could hear crickets in the distance, the hum of a passing car, the rhythmic creak of his rocking chair. He took a slow sip of coffee and let the calm sink in. He thought about everything that had happened. The fake officers, the public humiliation, the way Sandra's plan had crumbled under the weight of its own cruelty. But most of all, he thought about the lesson buried inside all of it. Authority, he realized, doesn't make a person powerful. Integrity does. Titles fade, jobs change, neighbors come and go, but how you treat people when you think no one's watching, that's what lasts. The doorbell camera had caught more than a crime that morning. It had caught a truth that echoed louder than any headline. That real strength isn't loud, and justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. When the porch light flickered off, Gregory stood and looked once more at the flag waving gently in the breeze. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't even proud. He was simply at peace. Because in the end he hadn't just cleared his name, he'd reminded an entire neighborhood what accountability looks like. And maybe, just maybe, a few of them would think twice before mistaking silence for weakness again. If you've stayed with this story until now, remember this. Character isn't proven in comfort. It's proven in conflict. So, when life tests your patience, keep your dignity close and your voice steady. That's how real change begins. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us who we are and who we should never become.